Get out there and sleep with the dog!
Get out there and sleep with the dog. That was what my daughter-in-law said to me on the day my husband died, right before she threw my suitcase into the garage like a pile of trash. I only smiled because she had no idea I was the one holding the secret to $23.5 million. That night, the rain never stopped. I sat in the cold, damp garage, surrounded by barking echoes from the dog and the laughter drifting down from upstairs. Every sound felt like a blade cutting into me, but I didn't shed a single tear. Thomas, my husband, once told me, "When they think you're weak, Cass, let them believe it. You'll know exactly when to rise." I thought that night was the deepest humiliation of my life. But no, it was only the beginning of a game whose rules only I knew. If you've ever been pushed into the dark, don't walk away, because this story will show you, even in silence, justice knows how to speak. Thank you for staying and listening to my story. Let me know which state you're watching from in the comments below. Because sometimes, as long as one person still believes in gratitude, justice, and humanity, this world remains worth trusting and worth living in. Rain had started falling before dawn even opened its eyes. The heavy drops poured over the cemetery, as if the sky understood that a part of my world had disappeared. I stood there among people dressed in black, yet I felt utterly alone, like a dark ink stain on an empty sheet of paper. My whole body was cold, not only because the rain seeped through my clothes, but because a hollow ache was spreading through my chest. Thomas was gone. The man who used to place his warm hand on my back whenever I trembled at life's cruelty now lay silent under a rain-soaked coffin, and I didn't know what to do except stand still. I, Elaine Carter, 58 years old, a dark-skinned woman who had walked through many storms, realized this morning that some storms never pass and some pains have no sound. I did not cry. Not because I was strong, but because I knew my tears would wash away the silence Thomas once told me to protect. From a distance, I saw Vanessa. My daughter-in-law looked impatient, her hand placed on the arm of a man I had never seen before. His name was Derek, someone whispered it nearby. His eyes skimmed over my husband's coffin without a single flicker of emotion. Vanessa wore a faint smile, trying to hide it, but not well enough. In the middle of this mourning scene, that smile felt wrong, almost cruel. I didn't know what they were thinking or what they were waiting for, but the look in Vanessa's eyes told me she wanted this funeral to end as quickly as possible. She didn't look at me, didn't look at Marcus, only stood with Derek as if they were the rightful owners of this moment. Something inside me tightened, but I did not react, not today. When people began leaving, I walked closer to the grave. The soil beneath my feet had turned soft and dark. I knelt down, placing my hand on the cold stone as if trying to touch Thomas one last time. My voice trembled, barely audible, meant only for him. "You once said, 'When they think I'm weak, let them believe it.' I will do that." I closed my eyes and let the words drift into the thick air, gentle as a breath, yet heavier than any vow I had ever made. A sharp gust of wind swept through the trees, lifting white petals into the gray sky. The silence around me deepened. It wasn't emptiness, it was the silence of someone who knows a battle is coming. I didn't know who my enemies were yet, but I sensed I wouldn't be fighting alone. As I stood, a detail caught my attention. An older man in a long coat approached, lightly touching my elbow and whispering just for me to hear, "Mrs. Carter, stay strong." Thomas was a co-founder of Serene Holdings, the clean energy investment company. For safety reasons, his name was never on the records. "You are the sole holder of the rights." I looked at him, saying nothing, though my heart shook. That sentence wasn't about wealth or pride. It was like a key dropping into my hands at the exact moment I needed it. I knew Serene Holdings. It was Thomas's life's work, the reason he spent sleepless months, the reason he refused lucrative offers. He once told me, "Elaine, sometimes the only way to protect what matters most is to keep your name off it." Now, more than ever, I understood. Here on the day I said goodbye, I realized there were secrets he left only for me, not to make me rich, but to help me survive among people who looked at me with quiet disdain. When I left the cemetery, my steps remained heavy, but no longer directionless. The rain did not stop, but something inside me had begun to light a small spark behind a thick cloud. I knew this was only the beginning. A tragic beginning, yes, but also the first step of a path I had no choice but to walk for myself, for Thomas, and for the truth waiting beneath the relentless rain of that morning. The rain had lasted through the entire morning, and by afternoon, the sky grew so dark it felt like the world was being swallowed by shadows. After the funeral, I returned home with Marcus and Vanessa. The house where I had lived for more than 30 years, once filled with laughter, now felt strangely foreign. The heavy wooden door closed behind us with a hollow thud that echoed through the hallway, sending a chill up my spine. I had always believed this place was where Thomas and I would grow old together, but as I stepped inside, I knew something fundamental had shifted. Not just because he was gone, but because of the way the people in front of me were looking at me. Vanessa was the first to speak. She set her purse on the table and brushed off the raindrops on her shoulder as if she had just returned from an errand, not from burying her father-in-law. Her eyes slid toward me, cold enough to make me tighten my trembling hands. Marcus stood beside his wife, silent as always, unable to look at me for more than a heartbeat. I barely took a step toward the staircase when Vanessa said, her voice sharp as a thin blade, "From now on, you go down there and sleep with the dog." Before I could fully understand her words, I saw my suitcase thrown to the floor. The loud crack of it hitting the tiles reverberated through the living room. I froze, the sound hitting me like a slap across the face. I looked down at the suitcase, then up at Vanessa. Her expression held no guilt, not even discomfort. On her face was something dangerously close to satisfaction. In her eyes, I was no longer a mother-in-law nor a grieving widow, but an inconvenience, an object in the way. Marcus stood there, still, his hands clenched, but not tightly enough to become fists. He avoided meeting my eyes, as if one look at me would force him to make a choice he wasn't ready to face. I saw the conflict in him, but his silence hurt more than any cruel word Vanessa could have thrown. I bent down and picked up the suitcase. My hands trembled, not because it was heavy, but because humiliation surged through me like a violent wave. I had thought I was familiar with the world's cruelty, but standing there in my own home, I realized there were kinds of pain no one could ever prepare for. Vanessa crossed her arms, her voice dripping with disdain. "I don't want to see you in the master bedroom anymore. That room is mine." I took a slow breath, trying to steady my voice. "Vanessa, today is Thomas's funeral. You can't at least..." She cut me off with a mocking laugh. "You think I care? You should be grateful I'm even letting you stay in this house." I turned to Marcus. His head hung low, eyes fixed on the floor. Part of me wanted to call his name, ask him why he wouldn't defend his own mother, but I knew that would only push him further into himself. And in that moment, I understood something. Silence wasn't weakness. It was saving your strength for when it mattered most. Thomas had taught me that, and I silently thanked him. I lifted the suitcase and walked toward the door leading to the garage. As I passed Vanessa, I spoke just loud enough for only the two of us to hear. One day, you'll need that dog more than I ever will. Vanessa froze for half a second before waving her hand dismissively, but I saw the flicker of irritation on her face. Good. My words weren't a threat. They were the truth she would understand eventually. The garage door creaked loudly as I opened it. A cold draft swept over me, instantly carrying the smell of damp concrete and the distant bark of the old dog. I walked down the steps, each one heavier than the last. Above me, Vanessa's heels clicked against the wooden floor, each tap sounding like a declaration of conquest. I set the suitcase in a corner. My heart ached, but I no longer felt the urge to cry. I finally understood what Thomas meant all those years ago. This wasn't an ending. It was the beginning of a trial I would have to face alone. And in the silence of that cold garage, I felt something starting to crack, not inside me, but in the facade that had covered this house for far too long. I sat down, placed my hand on the suitcase, and took a deep breath. In the darkness settling around me, I felt a familiar presence, a quiet strength like Thomas's hand resting on my shoulder, silent but steady, and I whispered to myself that this was not the moment to break. This was only the second chapter of a story I had no choice but to finish to the very end. The garage was darker than I expected. A single, dim yellow bulb hung from the ceiling, flickering as if it could burn out at any moment. Cold air seeped through the cracks under the door, carrying a damp smell that clung to my skin. Marcus's old dog lay curled up in a corner on a worn blanket, its gentle eyes watching me as if it understood the silence swallowing this house. I set my suitcase down and lowered myself onto the wooden stool he used when he fixed his bike years ago. I opened the leather journal I had carried for years. The first page still held a faint scent of the cedar Thomas loved, and when my fingers brushed the paper, my chest tightened. My hand trembled slightly as I wrote the first line, but the ink still formed clearly. First day being thrown out of the bedroom, not because I'm poor, but because they think I'm weak. The words sank into me like a reminder. I wasn't poor, never had been, and I wasn't nearly as fragile as they believed. But silence now wasn't surrender. It was strategy. Vanessa's laughter drifted down from the floor above, sharp and jarring against the stillness of the garage. It was the kind of laugh that came from someone who had forgotten they once had a heart. I closed my eyes and let the cold press against me. Each laugh felt like another slice through the dignity I tried to hold on to. And yet, no tears fell. I sat there motionless, listening to her heels clack against the wooden floor, then the slam of their bedroom door that made the ceiling shiver. If it had been any other time, I might have broken down, but tonight only silence circled around me thick like armor, slowly forming. I kept writing as though the words could rearrange the pieces of my shaken self. Through the steady patter of rain hitting the garage roof, a memory flickered to life. Thomas's voice, deep and steady, replayed in my mind. When they think you're weak, let them believe it. That's when you're strongest. His words held me upright the way they always had. I remembered the night he said that, the last calm evening before his illness worsened. He placed his hand on my shoulder and whispered, "Elaine, if everything ever collapses in front of you, don't rush to rise. Sit still, watch, listen. Those who are desperate to win reveal their weaknesses first." Back then, I didn't fully understand, but here in this cold garage, every word felt like a compass pointing me forward. Upstairs, I heard footsteps, then a heated exchange between Marcus and Vanessa. Their voices rose and fell, fragments slipping through the floorboards. "Not now," Marcus said. Vanessa shot back sharp and impatient. "We've waited long enough." I paused my writing and looked up at the damp, streaked ceiling. This house, built by Thomas and me brick by brick, was turning into a stage for a play I had no choice but to watch. I stood, walking slowly through the cluttered space. Beneath a layer of dust, I spotted a small wooden toolbox Thomas once used. I opened it, brushing past old nails and a rusted hammer, until I found a small notebook tucked inside. Its pages had yellowed with time, but his handwriting remained steady. He had written meeting notes, numbers, plans I had only half understood. Then, on the last page, a hastily scrawled line caught my breath. Elaine will know when it's time to stand. I closed the notebook, sat back down, and breathed deeply. My heart no longer felt like it was crumbling. I looked at the water streaking down the wall and realized the darkness here was not shrinking me. It was sharpening me. The old dog moved closer, resting its head against my leg. I stroked its fur gently and whispered, "We'll watch, won't we?" It didn't understand, but the warm weight of its head grounded me. That night, I wrote a few more sentences, then leaned back against the wall and closed my eyes. There were no sobs, no shaking shoulders, only the steady breathing of a woman learning to turn her pain into strength. In this cold, shadowed garage, the real battle began, and I knew when the moment came, I would rise exactly the way Thomas had taught me. I woke to a thin blade of light slipping through the garage door, cutting across the last traces of the night's darkness. My sleep had been shallow, but enough to pull me out of numbness. The air was still cold against my skin, carrying the damp smell of old metal and wood. I sat up, rubbing my hands together for warmth. The old dog lifted its head, watching me with cloudy eyes that still held a loyalty humans often fail to give. I rose slowly and climbed the steps leading back into the house. As soon as I opened the door, the scent of coffee and sharp perfume filled the air. Vanessa moved around the kitchen in her high heels, each step tapping sharply on the tiles. Marcus sat at the table, cupping a mug with both hands. His eyes looked tired, unfocused, as if he were drifting somewhere far from this home. When they saw me, neither spoke. My presence weighed on the room, invisible but heavy. I didn't speak either. Silence was still the best armor I had. But then something else caught my eye. A white envelope lay on the table, half tucked under a stack of mail. The logo was unmistakable: Serene Holdings, LLC. Before Vanessa could react, I stepped forward and picked it up. My name wasn't on it, but Marcus's was. I looked at him, then at her. "Someone sent a financial statement here," I asked calmly. Marcus hesitated, opening his mouth as if to explain, but Vanessa jumped in. "Just work documents, nothing to do with you." She snatched the envelope a little too quickly. Her hand trembled just barely, but enough for me to notice. People who hide secrets always slip by a millimeter when they think they still control everything. I pretended not to care, simply nodding before turning toward the hallway. But I had already memorized the details. Serene Holdings, LLC, an unmistakable link to Thomas's past. And now it was in someone else's hands. That was no coincidence. As I walked past the laundry room, a scent stopped me in my tracks. A bold, masculine cologne, one I didn't recognize. Not Marcus's, and certainly not Thomas's. I picked up the coat draped over the washing machine. The fragrance clung to the fabric, rich and unmistakably male. The coat was too large for Marcus, tailored and stylish, and caught between the fibers at the collar were a few short black hairs. My heart slowed, beating with a heavy, dull rhythm. It didn't take much imagination to know what this meant. Vanessa wasn't living inside grief like I was. She was living in another world entirely, one filled with secrets she thought she had hidden well. Marcus didn't see it, or maybe he couldn't bear to see it. I placed the coat back exactly where I found it and headed toward the kitchen for water. When I opened the cabinet, my fingers brushed against a folded slip of paper sticking out of a notebook. Curious, I pulled it free. My stomach tightened the moment I read the header. The Argonaut Hotel. I had stayed there with Thomas in our younger years. Elegant, expensive, known for privacy. The bill was dated just 3 days ago. 2 dinner entrees, a bottle of wine, a premium double room, and the reservation name, Vanessa Carter. The house seemed to fall into a chilling silence as I lowered the paper. I wasn't shocked. I wasn't even hurt anymore. What washed over me was something colder, steadier, like a thin layer of ice forming around my heart. All the pieces I had picked up that morning began to slot together. The financial statement, the cologne, the hotel receipt. Everything pointed in one direction. Vanessa had grown careless, too confident, too hungry for whatever life she was chasing. She forgot that in this house, every brick had known me for decades. Every corner carried the imprint of Thomas. Nothing could hide forever from someone who had lived and breathed this place for half a lifetime. I folded the receipt carefully and slipped it into my pocket. Not to confront her yet, I wasn't ready, but I knew this was the first clue fate had placed in my hands. No noise, no drama, just small cracks in a facade she thought was flawless. As I descended back into the garage, the cold breeze brushed against my sleeves as if reminding me who I was now. Above me, they probably believed I was trembling in fear. But under the trembling yellow bulb of that garage, I felt more awake than I had in days, and I knew this was only the first crack in the truth. Larger fractures were waiting just ahead. That night, the rain returned heavier than the nights before. I sat in the garage, the dim yellow bulb flickering above me, casting trembling shadows across the cold, damp floor. The clues I'd uncovered earlier kept looping in my mind like an old film refusing to stop. The bank statement, the scent of men's cologne, the hotel receipt. Each detail was a tiny needle, but together they pierced through the shell of silence I'd wrapped myself in. I didn't know what I would face next, but something deep inside warned me that the fragile calm around me was about to shatter. Just then, through the sound of heavy rain, my phone rang. The sudden noise jolted me as if someone had thrown a stone into still water. I looked at the screen, an unknown number. I thought I wouldn't receive any calls of importance after Thomas passed, but instinct pushed me to answer. Mrs. Carter, a deep, slightly raspy male voice said, "This is Whitaker." An old friend of Thomas's. I stood straight, heart tightening. The name unlocked a distant memory. I'd seen him a few times during Thomas's private meetings, but we'd never spoken much. Whitaker was always the quiet one in the background, observing everything with sharp eyes. The last time I saw him was years ago, when Thomas once told me, "Whitaker is the one man I trust more than myself." Now his voice reached me in the cold, rain-filled night, and I knew something important was about to unfold. "I have something Thomas asked me to keep," he said, pausing as if to gauge my reaction. "He told me to give it to you when the time was right." It felt like my breath slipped away from me. I asked quietly, "What is it? Why now?" "Because he knew someone would try to push you into the dark," Whitaker replied, his voice steady. "And he believed you would need these things to step out of it." 5 minutes later, I heard an engine outside. I opened the garage door. Headlights cut through the rain, illuminating the figure of an older man stepping out of the car. His hair was more silver than the last time I saw him, but his eyes were unchanged, sharp, observant, tinged with sorrow. Whitaker walked toward me, his long coat soaked from the storm. "I can't stay long," he said, handing me a thick envelope and a small metal box containing a USB. "Thomas gave these to me before things got worse. I took them, feeling the weight inside the envelope tremble against my palms. "Why didn't Thomas give these to me himself?" I asked. Whitaker looked at me for a long moment before answering. "Because he knew you wouldn't use them unless you were cornered. He trusted you, but he understood the people in this house." Their true faces would appear sooner or later. A strong gust of wind blew rain onto us, cold and sharp. I clutched the envelope, afraid it might slip away. "Thank you," I whispered. Whitaker placed a hand on my shoulder. "Don't trust anyone too quickly. Don't confront them yet. Read everything inside. Call me when you're ready." Then he turned and walked back into the storm, disappearing as silently as he had arrived. I returned to the garage, closed the door, and sat on the wooden stool. I opened the envelope with cold, trembling hands. Inside was a stack of documents neatly arranged. I lifted the first page, and the words stopped my heartbeat. Proof of ownership of assets totaling $23.5 million USD. Legal owner Elaine Carter. A sharp breath caught in my throat. I turned to the next page and saw Thomas's handwriting. The ink had blurred slightly from moisture, but the message was clear. "Elaine, you always thought you were the one standing behind me. But the truth is, Serene Holdings exists because of you. That wealth belongs to you. If they forget who you are, remind them with the truth." My fingers tightened around the page. Suddenly, the garage didn't feel as cold. Something warm flickered inside my chest. Not anger, not sorrow, something else. Power. Tonight, I was no longer just the woman cast into a garage. Tonight, I had taken my first step out of the shadows. And I knew these documents were the key to the battle I was destined to fight. This was only the beginning. I remained still in the garage long after finishing Thomas's letter. His handwriting felt as if it still carried a trace of warmth, seeping into the fractures inside my chest and sealing them with a strength I thought I no longer had. A woman shoved down to the coldest corner of the house was now holding proof of ownership for $23.5 million. The contradiction of it all created a strange silence, as if the air itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what I would do next. I placed the letter back inside the metal box, locked it, and set it on the highest shelf where no one in this house ever paid attention. But I kept the USB in my hand. I didn't yet know what it contained, but instinct told me it was just as important. Above me, footsteps moved across the floorboards, Vanessa pacing in the kitchen with her usual impatience. I stared up at the ceiling as if I could see through it. I understood then that the moment to rise hadn't arrived, but the moment to see clearly had. I opened Thomas's old toolbox and pulled out a small compact camera he once used for work. On one of the rare occasions he taught me about technology, he said, not to spy on anyone, but to protect yourself from things you can't always see. I had laughed back then, thinking he was being overly cautious. Now I realized Thomas had never wasted a single warning. The camera still worked, battery full. I stood in the garage doorway, looking toward the staircase leading up to the kitchen, where Vanessa loved to parade her confidence. If I wanted the truth, I had to start from the places where she felt most untouchable. I climbed the stairs quietly, each step slow and controlled. When I reached the door, I paused and listened. Vanessa's voice drifted through the kitchen, low, but not low enough to hide the thrill in it. "Tomorrow night, the same place, the Argonaut, right?" Her tone softened, sweet in a way she never used with her husband. "Don't worry about Marcus. He believes everything I tell him." A coldness crept along my spine, not because I was shocked, but because I finally heard the arrogance that would become her downfall. People who think they've won never bother to watch their blind spots. When she finally left the kitchen, I entered and placed the camera behind the corner cabinet, tucked into a blind angle, but with a full view of the room. Thomas once said, "Silence isn't standing still. Silence is arranging your pieces where no one sees them." I whispered that line to myself as I pressed the camera into place. My hands no longer trembled. They moved with a certainty that surprised even me. I did the same in the living room and the upstairs hallway. No noise, no mistakes. I felt like a sculptor rebuilding a shattered statue piece by piece. This house, once a home for Thomas and me, had turned into a labyrinth of shadows, but it was still a labyrinth I knew better than anyone. Later that night, back in the garage, I connected the cameras to Thomas's old laptop. One by one, frames appeared on the screen, showing their movements, their voices, their secrets. Within an hour, I had enough to know Vanessa wasn't just cheating on Marcus. She was knee-deep in something darker, exchanging money, meeting Derek, planning things I couldn't yet decipher. The infidelity was merely the surface. The real rot lay beneath. I clipped the most important recordings and saved them onto a new USB. Then I took a sheet of paper and wrote a short message to Whitaker. "Keep this safe. I will call when it's time." When I sealed the envelope, I stepped back and looked at the garage. This cold, damp place was no longer the corner they had banished me to. It had become my command room. From here, I would watch, analyze, and wait. I knew the right moment was approaching. I had the letter, the evidence, the first pieces of the puzzle, and now I held the sharpest blade of all the truth they never imagined I possessed. Thomas had been right. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I simply placed each piece into position in silence. And when the picture was complete, they would be the ones trembling. The counterattack had begun. Quiet, but sharper than any shout could ever be. That morning began with an unusual stillness. No hurried footsteps from Vanessa, no sound of coffee brewing, no sharp echoes of heels striking the floor. The house felt heavy, as if every corner of it sensed a storm approaching. I climbed up from the garage holding the USB that contained the recordings I had quietly gathered over the past days. Today was the day the lies in this house would finally be stripped bare. Marcus sat in the living room, hands clasped, staring into nothing. He glanced at me briefly before looking away. In his eyes, I didn't see indifference, but fear. Perhaps he sensed something coming, but lacked the strength to face it. I didn't blame him. Growing up under Vanessa's shadow had turned him into a man who struggled to choose his own battles. I looked around the room, then said calmly, "Everyone, come out here. We need to talk." Vanessa appeared on the staircase, arms crossed over the railing, irritation written all over her face. "What? Now? I don't have time for your nonsense." I didn't answer. I simply stared back at her until the smugness in her expression wavered. She descended the stairs, her heels clicking, though this time not as confidently as usual. When the three of us were finally gathered in the living room, I stood in the center, feeling as though this spot had been waiting for me all along. Vanessa spoke first, arrogance dripping from every word. "This house is mine. Whatever you're plotting, let me warn you now, you're going to lose." I plugged in the USB. No explanation, no introduction. The TV flickered, then the first clip appeared. Vanessa and Derek in the kitchen, talking about transactions from the Serene Holdings account. Her voice soft but sharp. "As long as Marcus doesn't know, everything will go as planned." Marcus swallowed hard, his hands shaking. The next clip played. At the Argonaut Hotel, Vanessa in a red dress, laughing with Derek as if betrayal were something glamorous. Her voice slid across the speakers. "The money will go through this week, and once it does, I'll throw that old woman out of the house." Vanessa jumped to her feet. "This is fake, edited. I'll sue you. I swear I will." I still didn't speak. I opened the third file. Footage of her transferring funds from Marcus's account into Derek's, followed by a text message, "Done. Marcus won't suspect a thing." Marcus staggered as if the ground had shifted beneath him. "Vanessa, what is this?" But she wasn't done clawing. "I did it for us, Marcus. Don't listen to her. Your mother hates me. She's trying to destroy us." The time had come. I placed a stack of papers on the table. "This is Thomas's will." Vanessa let out a laugh, brittle and mocking. "His will? I've seen it. The house and the money go to Marcus. You have nothing." I didn't argue. I simply opened the document. One page was enough to shatter the room. Legal owner of the entire estate, valued at $23.5 million, Elaine Carter. The silence that followed was explosive. Vanessa went white. Marcus stared at me as if seeing his mother for the first time in years. I finally spoke, voice calm and sharp. I didn't shout. I just opened the file at the right time. Vanessa's voice cracked. No, this is impossible. It's fake." Marcus cut her off, voice breaking. "Vanessa, stop. I've seen enough. You betrayed me." She lunged for the papers, but Marcus stepped between us. For the first time, he stood in front of me, not behind her. I saw heartbreak in his eyes, but also clarity. I looked at Vanessa, and for the first time, fear, real fear, shimmered behind her arrogance. She had misjudged everything. She thought I was the weak woman she pushed into the garage. She didn't know I was the one holding the secret Thomas had left behind. The storm had erupted, but this wasn't chaos without purpose. This was the moment every lie in this house was dragged into the light. And I knew from this day forward, the balance of power had changed hands. The living room still trembled with the echo of what had just unfolded. The footage on the TV hadn't even fully faded yet. A heavy silence was pouring over the house, thick enough to muffle even the smallest breath. Vanessa stood frozen in the center of the room, her hands trembling uncontrollably, her face drained of color like cold ash. Marcus stood in front of me, shielding me with his body for the first time in his life, his chest rising and falling as if he were struggling to hold himself together. I knew the main storm of my life had just passed, but the second one, meant for Vanessa alone, was only beginning. Vanessa screamed first. "You're all going to pay. I'll sue. This is my house. I'll get my lawyers. I'll make you lose everything." Her voice cracked, yet stubbornness still clung to every word, like a wild animal cornered and baring its teeth. I looked at her calmly. "You can do whatever you wish, but the truth remains the truth, Vanessa." Marcus turned toward his wife, and for the first time in years, he didn't look away. In his eyes, there was disappointment, pain, and something new, something unfamiliar, clarity. "No, Vanessa," he said, his voice breaking. "You're the one who destroyed this family." Her mouth fell open. It was as if Marcus had slapped her with the harshest reality she'd ever faced. She tried to speak, but no words came out. It was the first time she realized Marcus wasn't standing behind her anymore. And in that moment, her face began to crack. I didn't say anything. I wanted Marcus to see everything on his own. My silence all this time wasn't surrender, but giving him space to understand who was truly on his side. Moments later, Marcus's phone rang. He answered it, and his face slowly drained of blood as he listened. When he hung up, his voice was barely more than a whisper. "Derek's been arrested," he said, eyes fixed on Vanessa. "The FBI is investigating him for money laundering, and they're tracking the accounts connected to him." At that, Vanessa stared at me as though I had pulled the sky down on her head. She stumbled backward, her breathing shallow and uneven. No. Derek said everything was covered. He said no one would find out. I stepped closer, meeting her eyes. You thought you were playing a game with me, but you were only replaying a game my husband already mastered. She flinched. I saw it clearly, the fear she had never felt before. Vanessa had always believed she could control everything, always believed she was the smartest in the room. But she forgot something Thomas never overlooked. Those who rush to win reveal their weaknesses first. Vanessa collapsed onto the sofa, hands gripping her tangled hair. The truth hit her too fast, too brutally, leaving her no room to breathe. Marcus sank onto the couch beside me as if he had finally found a place to anchor himself. "I'm sorry, Mom," he whispered. "I've been blind for too long." I rested my hand on his shoulder. "It's not your fault. People see what they want to see." The truth waits for the moment it's needed. Vanessa bolted upright and stumbled upstairs. A moment later, the door slammed so hard the whole house shook. But I didn't feel that familiar heaviness anymore. Instead, I felt a strange sense of equilibrium settling into place. Vanessa had destroyed herself piece by piece with the very moves she thought would raise her higher. And I knew this wasn't the end, but it was a pivotal moment. A moment where justice began to surface, not through shouting or vengeance, but through truth. The house was quieter than it had ever been after Vanessa shut herself inside the upstairs bedroom. The chaos of the confrontation still echoed faintly through the walls, like the final tremors of an earthquake that had just shattered the thin shell of lies holding this family together. I stood in the living room and drew a long breath, not out of exhaustion, but because for the first time in months, I felt something I thought I had lost forever: relief. The next morning, sunlight slipped through the windows and spread across the walls as if trying to heal everything that had been broken. I walked into the kitchen and poured myself a cup of hot tea. For the first time since Thomas died, the tea no longer tasted bitter. Perhaps because the quiet inside me had finally returned, not the forced silence of fear, but the calm of someone who has just walked through a storm. Marcus appeared in the doorway, his eyes dark from a sleepless night, but clearer than before. He sat down, cupping his hands around a mug of coffee, like he was trying to warm a soul that had grown cold. "Mom," he said softly, "thank you for not giving up on me." I smiled gently, surprised by how soft it felt. "You've always been my son, Marcus, but sometimes a person has to get lost for a while to know where home is." He lowered his head, shame and regret tightening his voice. "I let her lead me around. I trusted the wrong person. I rested my hand on his. Everyone is weak at some point. What matters is that you finally saw the truth." The house felt lighter after that moment. Marcus still had a long road ahead of him, but he had taken the first and hardest step, choosing to stand on the side of truth. That afternoon, I entered Thomas's old study. Sunlight spilled across the table, illuminating a new folder I had placed there. It contained the founding documents of the Thomas Carter Foundation, the charity I decided to create to help women gain independence and escape controlling environments, just as I had once needed to do. I looked at Thomas's photo sitting next to the folder. "I want this to carry your name," I whispered, "because you always believed people deserve a second chance." When I signed the papers, I felt a door inside me open, not the door of vengeance, but of hope. Thomas always said I was stronger than I believed. Now I wanted to prove him right, not for Vanessa, not for those who underestimated me, but for myself. A few days later, before preparing to move out and begin a new chapter of my life, I left something behind for Vanessa. A thin envelope placed quietly at her door. Inside was an amount of money, small, but enough to keep her from falling into complete ruin, along with a letter. Not to forgive you, I wrote, but so you can learn how to be human again. Some might say that was too generous, but kindness is not something I give away lightly. It's something Thomas taught me to keep for myself, and no one can take that from me, not even someone who tried as hard as Vanessa did. That evening, as I stepped outside, headlights washed over the driveway. Whitaker emerged from his car, moving slowly but steadily. "Mrs. Carter," he said, "Thomas would be proud of you." I looked at him, trying to keep my voice from catching. "I'm just doing what I believe I should." Whitaker held my gaze, his eyes deep and weary. "There's something you didn't know," he said. "Thomas saved my life years ago. From that day forward, I swore I would protect what mattered to him. So everything I've done wasn't out of obligation, but gratitude." A chill slid down my spine, not of fear, but from the weight of truths unfolding before me. Thomas had always touched lives quietly, profoundly. Men like Whitaker did not appear by chance. As he walked away, I remained in the driveway, watching the streetlights shimmer across the leaves overhead. For the first time in a long while, I felt warmth spreading through my chest. Tonight, my heart wasn't heavy. It glowed softly like a candle relit after days of being battered by the wind. And I knew that this light would guide me toward the final part of my journey, a journey I had walked through pain, through truth, and now through a reborn kindness. I left that house on a warm Florida morning when the sunlight stretched across the ocean like a sheet of gold. Small waves rolled onto the shore, leaving thin white trails behind them, gentle as the ocean's own breath. I stood there with my feet sinking into the sand, the wind brushing through my hair like a quiet greeting. My life had shifted too many times during the dark months before this moment, but now I felt I was finally standing in the light. I sat on the familiar wooden chair and opened the journal I had carried since the night I was thrown into the garage. A clean page lay before me waiting for something important, and for the first time, I wasn't afraid of its emptiness. I closed my eyes briefly, letting the sound of waves echo like Thomas's whisper. Then I wrote slow but steady. "I kept my promise, Thomas. I didn't lose myself." I paused and looked out at the sea. Seagulls circled the blue sky, their distant cries full of freedom. I smiled. When Thomas left, I thought my life would drown with him, but it turned out I was being led to a different shore, a place where loss no longer dragged me down, but became a memory I could be grateful for. I thought about Vanessa, about the days she scattered seeds of deceit throughout my home. I thought about Marcus, my son, who had been torn between truth and sweet lies. I even thought about Derek, the man who believed he could slip through the cracks of the law. But now all of them felt far away, like shadows dissolving into the horizon. What remained wasn't hatred, it was a lesson. Betrayal in the end is just a mirror reflecting the true nature of people. The wind grew stronger, carrying salt that brushed against my skin. I opened my eyes and felt deep in my chest the meaning of something Thomas once said, words I only fully understood after the storms passed. Justice doesn't need a scream, only the truth spoken at the right moment. Those words echoed inside me clearer than ever. There was no need to shout, no need to fight blindly. All I had to do was open the right door at the right time. The truth handled the rest. I stood and walked along the beach. Each step left a print in the sand, only to be washed away by the waves moments later. But I didn't mind. Not every mark needs to stay. Some things only need to live inside us. The nights in the cold garage were gone, the days of humiliation gone. What remained was the woman shaped by everything she had overcome. I turned back toward the open horizon, imagining Thomas standing there. I could almost see his gentle, steady gaze. I could almost hear his voice carried in the wind. "You're strong now, Elaine." I smiled and lifted my head. Then, just as I had faced every trial, I spoke the message I wanted to leave for anyone who has ever been dismissed, hurt, or pushed into darkness with no one to defend them. I spoke slowly, clearly, without trembling. If you've ever been underestimated, just smile. Because when you rise, the world will fall silent. I stood there for a long time, letting the wind carry those words out across the water like a gift for anyone still searching for their own way out of the shadows. I hoped that one day they would find their light just as I found mine. When the sun rose higher and the waves began to crash louder, I closed my journal. One chapter had ended, and before me was a completely new one. I didn't know what the future would bring, but for the first time in many years, I was ready to walk toward it without looking back. And I knew that even though Thomas was no longer here, the light he left behind would guide me always.